Well, one of the reasons I wanted to have this conversation with you is I listened to the sustainability study that NAR or summit that they did here a couple of weeks ago. And they talked about obviously sustainability, and their other two focuses was resilience and safety. And I talk a lot about resilience and safety in my training, in my books. I'm adding the sustainability portion to it now. But resilience is something that people really don't quite comprehend what that means unless they come from the emergency world or they've looked at resiliency. And I know a little bit about your life history, so you've been very resilient over the years. To you, what does it mean to be resilient?
I it's a couple of things. I would say first it's about showing up and being visible. I think second, it's about not giving up. If this path isn't working, try a different path. I think it's about having the long view, and it's about endurance. It's about physical endurance, and it's about emotional endurance. And again, I go back to this tie that I've come to appreciate between physicality and your brain. And I had a friend years ago that would say, if I'm physically strong, I'm mentally strong. And I think that's so important in terms of resilience. I think another huge component of this is taking the time to recharge, taking time for you. And then finally, I'll just say, this is an old saw, but doing things right versus doing the right things. If you don't take time for you to figure out what the right things are for you, you're going to waste your resilience. You
Exactly.
want to go back into the arena for a battle or an experience that really matters to you and is going to get you where you want to go. So I know that's not a very pat answer, but I think resilience is a lot of different things over your life experience.
Oh, I think it was brilliant what you just said. So there was a study done. It was a Harvard business school. It was a Yale. There was a bunch of think tanks. It was all done in 2011. And what they did is they looked at mindfulness practices, so like meditation and breathing and all those sorts of things. And they took 57 industry leaders from different sectors of business and they divided them in half. And half of them did not do anything different. And the other half went through a mindfulness practice. Well, before they started the training, they did all these MRIs on people's brains. They did all these psychological testing and all this incredible stuff. And then they put them through 8 weeks of mindfulness training. And then they had them do it for another 12 weeks. So 20 full weeks that these people were doing mindfulness practices. The results were unbelievable, and especially when it comes to resiliency. First of all, they found that resiliency increased by over 90% by doing these mindfulness practices. And they were simple. They were like 10 minutes that you can incorporate into your day. Over 90% resiliency, over 80% improvement on collaboration, and over 80% improvement on complex thinking and the ability to do so. They then took a few years later, they took that study and they combined it with 19 other studies. This was a university out of British Columbia.
Mm-hmm.
And they looked at the brain, what happens to the brain when you're doing mindfulness practices. And it actually grows in size. Now, I'm of the age that anything I can do to grow my mind is a really, really good thing.
Right.
But I think resiliency is really, I think when we get to be our age, we're able to look at resiliency and say, resiliency is what got me through this, the persistence, the being able to find my way through and to build back better, because we learn from our mistakes. We learn from what we're doing. And so I think it's really critically important, especially as we get older, to really understand how important our practices, our exercise, our meditation, and what other reading and all those kinds of things, that the important role they play
Right.
in how we're going to grow and continue our lives, right?
And the good thing is that as you're older and hopefully you're in a position where some of your professional responsibilities are more, what do I want to do, as opposed to what do I have to do, you can really orchestrate a life experience that allows for that, because I certainly remember periods in my life when my girls were younger where I was just constantly running, just constantly running. And at some point, kind of something's got to give. So I think that's one of the really fruits of being older, is being able to make choices that just weren't accessible to you when you were younger. And
Absolutely.
one of the one, as you're saying, it's so important to take that time to figure out what you should be doing.
Exactly. Well, I have a really, really good example of that. So I, up until the pandemic, twice a year, I did retreats in Mexico. And usually there was usually a couple of men involved. Usually it was mostly women, but usually, well, this particular time, there were no men at all. It was all women. And most of the women were over the age of 65. There were a couple that were younger. And we were all out. We were taking a break. We're out by the pool, and the ocean was right there in front of us. And all of a sudden, one of the ladies sees some dolphins, and they all go running down to the water. And this one younger, well, she wasn't young, she was in her 50s, but she jumps into the water. Well, there had been a hurricane like the week before, and the water was still churning, and it always has a riptide anyway. Well, my partner and I were standing up by the pool, and we see everybody over here. All of a sudden, we see her going this way, and she's got caught up in the riptide.
Oh, dear.
And we grabbed the ring and run down there. And this one young woman who was a competitive swimmer when she was in high school and college, she stood up, she stopped for like 30 seconds. She stopped, she looked around, you could tell she was breathing, and she knew she was the one to go. And then this other woman who was a triathlon person, they both took off to go get her. And what was weird is all the rest of us knew exactly what our roles were by their actions. But she did exactly, there's an acronym in the emergency management world called STOP. And the first thing you do is you stop. You stop, and then you observe. You take some breaths, and then you observe what's going on inside first, and then outside second. And then you proceed with a plan. And it's used a lot in emergency situations, but it can be used in everyday life. And I use it all the time now. I mean, I just stop, take some breaths, and then observe what I need to do, and then just move forward. But fortunately, she almost died. She almost drowned, but we got her back to shore just about the time. By the way, there's no such thing as 911 in Mexico, just saying. Yeah. The EMTs show up just as we're getting her out of the water. And she had a lot of water in her lungs and that sort of thing. So they stayed with her. They came and visited her like till 11 o'clock at night to make sure she was okay. But if it hadn't have been for this one young woman, who knows what would have really happened.
Right.
And that, I think that's a lesson that I'll never forget, the feeling of helplessness and the feeling of, and then all of a sudden with her taking that action, and everybody just followed suit, knew what exactly they needed to do. So I think when it comes to resiliency and building back better, if we can learn from those types of mistakes, in the emergency world, resilience is used to talk about infrastructure. Like I know here a few years ago in California, all of the overpasses on the I-5 coming up through the state were reinforced for earthquakes. And that was to build better resiliency. Emergency management people use the word resiliency to measure the community's ability to build back better. And if something happens, what can they mitigate? What can they do to prevent it from happening again?
Right.
We need to use resiliency all the time when we're doing our planning, when it comes to whether it's disasters or anything. We need to have those little contingency plans that we know if something goes wrong, that we kind of know what we're going to need to do. And that creates resiliency, which also creates confidence.
Right.
And so I think resiliency is we're talking a lot about it in these current last couple of years, especially with the pandemic and everything. Let's face it, we've had to be very resilient and very being able to change on a dime. So, and we certainly have seen that in the real estate industry. The industry's done an amazing job of pivoting and moving and changing and adapting to the new norms. So
it's amazing what people can do when they have to, right?
Totally, 100%. So, well, And I talk a lot about that. I have a new book. I'm going to plug it. It's When the Unthinkable Happens, Be Prepared, Be Ready. And I talk about
Beautiful.
resiliency. I talk about leadership. I talk about communication, in addition to what you need to have to be prepared. Because by being prepared, you become resilient. You know exactly what you're going to need to do.
You know, Connie, what this reminds me of is in strategic planning. I don't know, it's been maybe 20, 30 years since this book came out, but it was called Scenario Planning. It was called The Art of the Long View. And essentially, it was based on the idea that nobody's going to get the forecast right, but there are big things and maybe some small things with big impact that might happen that we need to think about. And I really think that's what you're saying. You know, what are the scenarios with either the biggest probabilities or small probability, huge impact, that we need to think this through so that when we stop on the beach, we actually have something in our head to go to and say, okay, I'm a competitive swimmer. I can beat the tide. Here's what I'm going to do. So I think that what you're doing really ties into that whole um, uh, scenario planning methodology that I think is just absolutely brilliant.